Okay. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So welcome everybody. Tonight's session for East and West Learning Connections is a review of one of 5 policies that have been adopted by the organization. And we'll be focusing tonight on the Code of Conduct, which is sort of a central piece of policy that, that the organization has put in place in order to help refine and define who we are, how we operate, what we want to do, and how we move forward as an organization. One of the things that I have been really excited about in the early stages of getting set up has been the opportunity to help shape that policy and to sit down with the other directors on the board and have long and really fruitful conversations about what it is we're trying to do and how we're going at things. And in order to help that process, we've really tried to put some administrative tools in place for us to be able to operate well and continue to operate well into the future. What I would like to do is to just start by letting you guys know that the text of the Code of Conduct is available on our website. If you just go to eawlc.org/Code of Conduct and Ethics Policy. And that's, all those words are separated by hyphens. So, but if you just Google Code of Conduct, East and West Learning Connections, you'll get it. So that's a place to start. The full text is available there. What I'm going to do is really just sort of introduce the whole process by saying that in January of this year, we registered as a federal not-for-profit corporation. And what that does is it gives us some real structure, a real sort of presence in the landscape. I think what it does as well is it sort of formalizes the responsibilities we as a board of directors have with respect to the organization and its operation. And in order to do that, we've had to put a number of administrative tools in place, as I mentioned. So we've been developing those administrative processes and including enacting a bylaw, and which we'll talk about once we get to discussing the upcoming annual general meeting, which will be our first, and a series of policies that help guide our conduct as we go forward. Why do we need policies? Policies are part of the administrative structure of the organization. And what they do is, in addition to the mission and the vision and the bylaws, they really are the corporation's values. They're the things we believe in. They're the way we agree to behave with each other and with sort of people outside the organization. And in order to do that, we, the board, have adopted a number of policies. The Code of Conduct really is the linchpin to the whole thing. It's the central piece of policy that refers to other policies and sort of brings them in under its umbrella. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the actual provisions in the policy. Who does it apply to? It's basically geared towards all volunteers, and that includes the board of directors, everybody on the board of directors, and the president, because we're all volunteers too. And why should it apply to all of those volunteers and the board and everybody? It's because as volunteers, we're all representatives of the organization, right? Whether it's to our members, to each other, to external agencies, individuals, to the public at large, we are representing the organization by volunteering to act on its behalf. One of the interesting things we came up against when we were talking about registration and becoming a corporation is that a corporation is an entity in law. It actually exists as if it were a person, but not being corporeal, it doesn't actually have the ability to act on its own. So its directors act on its behalf. So everything the directors do, and in fact, by extension, everything the volunteers do, is in essence, an action being taken by the organization. So from that respect, our behavior is the behavior of the organization. Okay? The other thing that's critical to understand about the way the Not-for-Profit Corporations Act works is that we have an obligation to act in the best interests of the organization. And what that means is that we're bound to protect its interests. So in doing this, we're kind of bound to behave well, because to do otherwise really sort of undercuts the reputation of the organization. It undermines public confidence in the organization, and it really affects our ability to operate. Because if we don't have a sense of trust with the people outside the organization, they're not going to help support us in striving for our what we're trying to accomplish, right? So we're going to see all of these principles sort of incorporated into the provisions of the policy as we go through. So it's laid out in 5 parts, this code of conduct, this policy that we've adopted. The first part is a rationale, why we should have a policy in the first place. 2 is the purpose, what we hope to achieve by implementing this policy. 3 is the policy itself, what's okay and what's not okay. 4 is responsibility for compliance, which includes a whole complaints process. And 5 is provisions for the disclosure of wrongdoing. And I'll explain what all that means as we get to it. The important thing to realize is that the last 2 parts really are what to do if someone behaves badly. And again, we'll go through each of those parts in a little more detail as we move forward. But the idea is to identify behavior that's inconsistent with the code of conduct and with its provisions, and which is, by extension, bad for the organization. Okay. Are there any questions so far before I get into the actual meat of the policy?
Sorry, I just have a question here.
Yeah.
So is the code of conduct policy lay the foundation for the other policies, or it's just one of a bunch of policies?
That's a great question. They sort of interlock with each other. So for example, we have an anti-discrimination policy that really talks about the provisions of the Human Rights Code and what is acceptable behavior with respect to other people. What that does is it reinforces the dignity of other people and how we should treat them and how we should not behave towards them. And that is part and parcel of a broader code of conduct that includes other provisions as well. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I get into the actual meat? Okay, let's get started. Let's look at the different parts of the code. So part 1 is the rationale. And really what this says is that everyone is entitled to expect that we conduct ourselves with the highest standards, right? We behave as well as it is possible for us to behave. And that's just a statement of what people should be able to expect from us. And that applies to all volunteers and the board of directors as well. And it says that all activities should be conducted in a fair, open, and transparent manner. And I think that's really, really important. There are certain aspects of board activity that has to be dealt with in a private setting because of the sensitive nature of what is being discussed. If we're talking, for example, about an issue concerning discipline or bad behavior, and we'll get to some of that down the list a bit, it's important not to have those conversations in public because there may be issues that are discussed that are sensitive and might adversely affect the individuals being discussed. or they might reflect badly on the reputation of the organization if there's disagreement at the board level. Again, some of these are provisions that we'll talk about as we go through the content of the code. It's really important to note the last sentence in the rationale. And it basically says that all volunteers and directors are, they're expected to abide by the organization's aspirations as encapsulated by its vision, its goals and projects as described by its mission, and that includes the operating principles that are embodied in the bylaw, and particularly its values as expressed in its policies. These are all meant to advance its objectives, the organization's objectives, and to protect its interests. So really, at the end of the day, the point of the code is to protect the interests of the organization and to further its objectives by making it as good and as upstanding and as honest an organization as it can be. Part 2, the purpose, really just puts into effect what the rationale has tried to encapsulate. So it's to set out what kinds of behaviors are okay and what kinds are not, to provide a standard against which behavior can be measured. And really one of the key components here is in the second sentence of the purpose statement. And that is that private conduct is a personal matter, except where except when it compromises the integrity or the reputation of the organization. And I know that there's going to be a question later about that, but really what it does is it embodies a principle that's quite common in Western law, which is the idea that we live under a social contract. We live in an environment with others. And what that means is that we have as much personal freedom as we can exercise without doing harm to others, right? So the limitation on my personal freedom is actually your personal freedom. The idea there is that I can exercise my free will in whatever way I want, as long as it doesn't harm you. And just an example of that is, you know, I might exercise my free will by firing a gun down your street. That's something I could do, but it's something I don't do, because to do that would endanger you. Similarly, if you were to fire a gun down my street, I would get quite upset about that as an infringement of my personal freedom, because I would feel threatened by that behavior. And so we live in this state where we limit our own freedom in order to abide well with others, right? And really, that's what this provision is meant to embody, is this idea that as long as our behavior doesn't compromise the integrity or the health or fostering of the organization, then you can basically do whatever you want, as long as you're doing it not as a representative of the organization, okay? Let's go on to part 3, which is the policy itself. And I'm going to rip through this pretty quickly because I know we want to have a lot of time for discussion here. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. The introduction really talks about all of our activities really are meant to be fully consistent with the interests of the organization. Provision 1 talks about being familiar with the values and all of the sort of rules and regulations that govern the organization. You can't sort of help someone if you don't understand them, right? So the idea is you have to be familiar with the mission and the values and the vision and the bylaws in order to operate correctly with respect to those. And foster the health of the organization. Number two, really, you just have to behave honestly. You know, operating in a way that is deceitful or fraudulent is going to work against the best interests of the organization. Number three really talks about conducting affairs in a lawful way. So not basically contravening any of the local laws, the laws of Ontario or Canada. 4 just basically says you should act in good faith. So, you know, don't break contracts, don't set people's expectations unrealistically. Don't say you're going to do something and then not do it. Number 5 really ties in the whole idea of the Human Rights Code in Ontario, and basically says we must treat each other respectfully, and we must do that in accordance with the Human Rights Code that's part of the law of Ontario. And what that does is it ensures that all of our behavior is respectful of other people, their cultures, their circumstances, and make sure that everyone is welcome, really. Number 6 is just avoiding offensive behavior. We should not condone violence or harassment or profanity. 7 talks about confidentiality and the idea that we have an obligation to respect people's privacy and also to preserve, you know, if the organization has goals and aspirations, not to subvert those because we have leaked sensitive information that might adversely affect our operation. Number 8 is an interesting one. It has to do with respecting the decisions of the board. When we talk about the bylaws, we'll talk about the fact that the board of directors, they are volunteers, but they're also elected positions. And what that means is they hold a responsibility to do their very best to govern the organization as well as they can. And what that means is there's a certain trust that has to be engendered between the membership and the board, such that if the board leads the organization in a certain direction by making certain decisions, that the membership is really obligated to uphold those decisions. And there are provisions for dissent. There are ways to disagree. But that disagreement should happen either privately or outside of the organization altogether. And what I mean by that is if you decide that you disagree with the way the organization is being run, you're completely free to cancel your membership and you know, move outside so that you can then criticize from outside. But being critical or showing dissent by disagreeing or disobeying provisions that are made by the board in their best efforts to act in the best interests of the organization and its goals really detracts from the ability of the organization to achieve those goals. And I know there's going to be conversation on that point. Number 9 basically is a follow-on to number 8, and it basically says that if you disagree, there are proper channels for disagreement. And what that means is bring your concerns to the board or air them at a meeting of the members. So there are ways to work internally with the membership, with the board of directors, to affect change if you disagree fundamentally with the actions being taken by the organization. The idea is that we want to work together. We want to help each other see more clearly, make better decisions. That doesn't mean you can't criticize. It just means that you want to bring that criticism inside to a discussion amongst the people who are invested in the well-being of the organization and its objectives. Okay, and I can further clarify that if people need me to. So the idea there is really that in order to move effectively forward, we all sort of have to get behind the decisions that the board makes. And if you think about it as, a wagon with a team of horses, if all the horses are pulling in different directions, the wagon doesn't go anywhere, right? We have to get all of the horses pulling in the same direction in order for that wagon to move in the right direction. And that's really what we're all trying to achieve. 10 deals with communications, and really all that's being said there is that when you are acting as a representative of the organization, you need to conduct yourself in a professional manner, and with the idea of representing the organization to its best effect. So that means not engaging in communications as a representative of the organization where you're, for example, using profanity or engaging in inappropriate behavior or speaking with disrespect to other people in ways that contravene the Human Rights Code, those sorts of things. It is not intended to be a limitation on your free right of speech, because again, it differentiates between being part of the organization and not being part of the organization. And you can operate in whatever fashion you choose in your private life, as long as that behavior doesn't negatively impact the organization, right? Number 11, is one that Yang and I actually had a conversation about, and I know she has a question on this. It has to do with not publicly criticizing the organization, and it's really a follow-on from the previous couple of provisions. And what it basically says is what I was saying before about how if you have criticisms, what you want to do is bring those criticisms into the place where they can be acted on effectively. And that basically means to the board and to the membership. It's impossible for me as an individual to correct my behavior if I don't know I'm doing something wrong, or if I don't know that there's a better way to do something. What I rely on is my friends and family and the people that I trust to come to me and say, there's a better way to do this. And so that's sort of what we're trying to achieve with this provision, is rather than airing your grievances outside in public, bring them into us. We will review them, and if they're valid, we'll act on them. So there is a process for criticism. It's just a question of whether it's aired publicly or not. And to air grievances publicly, in general terms, is probably not the best way to reinforce and further the intentions of the organization. Number 12 is pretty straightforward. We just won't tolerate illegal drug use or those sorts of activities with respect to the organization. That's something we don't want to be associated with at all. And again, while volunteering, we would ask that individuals not be under the influence of either drugs or alcohol, legal drugs I'm talking about, simply because those things, if they get out of hand, can seriously impact your ability to act in ways that are appropriate and undercuts your ability to represent the organization well. Similarly, if you're under a doctor's orders to take a prescription that's going to seriously impact your ability to volunteer with us, we need to know about that. That information would be kept confidential, but it might mean that on a temporary basis, you as a volunteer might be reassigned to a different role. So just as an example, if you're a volunteer who has a particular position of responsibility with respect to other members or with respect to children or something like that, where part of your responsibility is to be aware and be able to make adult decisions, responsible decisions, and the medication impairs that ability, then we need to know that so that we don't put you in a position where your ability to function as our representative is compromised, and the safety of those other individuals is also compromised, right? So that's a sort of private provision that we would like to make, put in place so that we ensure that everybody stays safe and happy and healthy. And that really is the core of the provisions, but the code also in section 3 also refers to the other policies that I was mentioning earlier, and requires that those policies are complied with. So, for example, it refers to a harassment and violence policy. Unfortunately, those aren't quite drafted yet. We're working on them, but it's almost there. We do have an anti-discrimination policy. We have a conflict of interest policy. We have a privacy policy in place as well. And there's also a mention of a disclosure of wrongdoing policy, which is actually incorporated in the Code of Conduct as Section 5. There's also an additional policy for people on the board called duties of directors that we've adopted as well. But that is not covered in this Code of Conduct because it doesn't necessarily apply to all volunteers and members. Let's talk about Part 4 very briefly. So the thing to understand is that we have what's called an ethics executive, and that is someone who is responsible for upholding ethical behavior right across the organization. And that person is, by this provision, the president of the organization. If for some reason the behavior of the president is at any point called into question, then the duties of ethics executive devolves to the vice president. And if the allegations pertain to both those individuals, then it falls to the board in its entirety to act as a kind of gathered ethics executive. The role of the ethics executive, as I said, is to ensure that ethical behavior is maintained, that any allegations are investigated, and that appropriate action is taken. So one of the things that's required is that everybody in the organization is really required to be aware of and to agree to abide by this code of conduct. And that's a really important first step in making sure that everybody is aware of their obligations. And we don't want to make it sound onerous, because honestly, most of this stuff is what people do anyway in dealing decently with each other. But it's just sort of putting down formally, what our expectations are, so that if people do deviate and behave really badly, we have something to point to and say, hey, we don't allow this behavior. See, it's written down here, and allow us to sort of make judgments based on that. 4.1 compliance really talks about the sort of what you do if you notice bad behavior, and the idea is to bring that straight to the ethics executive, aka the president, and or the board, and make sure that we're aware that there's something going on. We know about a lot of stuff, but we don't necessarily know everything. Those allegations will be taken seriously, and an investigation will be initiated and will be documented as well. Notification to the offending party will be done in writing, and the opportunity to respond would be in writing. And any final decisions with respect to discipline would also be documented and kept in the organization's records. 4.2 penalties is really self-explanatory. It just talks about what, at the discretion of the executive, the ethics executive and or the board, are the things that we can, as an organization, do to discipline people. And it's everything from, a talking to expulsion from the organization. And really, finally, part 5, which is the disclosure of wrongdoing, is kind of like a whistleblower clause. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that idea, the idea that that someone who out of a sense of duty to the organization, sees something going on that is directly opposed to our intentions, our stated intentions through this code of conduct and our other policies, and brings that information forward and discloses it, that they are protected, right? We make a compact to protect someone who, in good faith, comes forward and discloses wrongdoing, because our health as an organization depends on it. If we don't know that something is going on and then something, suddenly gets out into the public and it blows up and it negatively affects us as an organization, we need to know about these things and we need to deal with them quickly and effectively in order to maintain the good health and reputation of the organization. And that's really the essence of the disclosure of wrongdoing section. What is wrongdoing as defined under this section? It's basically breaking the law, knowingly putting people in danger, reckless mismanagement. I love that phrase. It basically means mismanaging the affairs of the organization to the point where it is threatened with collapse, right? Or really counseling anybody to coercing someone into behaving in any of those bad ways. Those are the 4 provisions that are identified under the definition of wrongdoing in the section. The key point here is that anybody coming forward and disclosing wrongdoing will be protected from reprisal, and that anyone engaging in reprisal will themselves be disciplined as part of the problem, right? So that's the way we try to protect the people who come forward and help us by disclosing wrongdoing. The disclosures should be made to the ethics executive and or the board of directors, depending on what the nature of the allegation is. And as I said, immediate disclosure allows us to act quickly to correct the situation and get things back on track. And really that's the essence of the code in a nutshell. I know I've sort of thrown a lot at you guys all at once. And I'm hoping there will be a lot of questions and discussions to sort of go through this and pick it apart and come to a better understanding of it. But that really is the essence of it. And finally, just a reminder that all of the policies that we've adopted so far are available on our website at eawlc.org. And if you just look for the policies, they're all posted there. And if you have any questions after we're done here, the best way to pose those questions would be to just send us an email at info@eawlc.org. That will end up on Yang's desk, and if she needs clarification from me or anybody on the board, we'll get that and get an answer back to you. I want to really thank you for being patient and listening to me drivel on for as long as I have, but I'm really hoping that that there will be some questions. And I know, Yang, you've got some questions that you had sort of looked at and shared with the group as part of the notice this afternoon, right?
Yes, yes. Well, but first of all, I want to thank you, Ian, for a wonderful presentation. So now we all know basically what this policy is all about.
Did I go on too long? I mean, we talked about trying to get this in 15 minutes, and I just thought, oh, I don't think I can do it in 15.
No, it's good. It's good. Yeah. So, anybody has any question for Ian? So.
I do.
Huh?
This is Irene. Thank you very much.
Hi, Irene.
So I do. So this is the first time I come to the meeting.
Yeah.
So I just need a little bit more background infos. So we have 5 sessions to discuss this code of conduct, or so, we have other topics to.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick each of the policies that have been adopted so far, and we're going to discuss each one in each of the 5 sessions. So this one is for the code of conduct. The next one we'll do is for the conflict of interest policy, and we'll go through the anti-discrimination and privacy policies, and finally the duties for directors.
Oh, okay, I get it. Okay, thank you.
So yeah, by the end of the 5 sessions, you'll have a really solid idea of what our policies are and why they're in place. I hope. I really hope.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I heard Zara raised her hand. Zara?
Hello there. I am Zara and studying public law at UFT right now. And the good thing is I am taking a course about law and public policy. I was wondering, because since I'm in the course, I still don't understand what are the difference between law and the policies. Because, for example, every university have a different policy, but this is not mean they are not law. But I didn't get the still definition of between law and the policies.
Right. Okay. That's a big, complicated question. What does law do? Law describes an entire society's rules for conduct. So, for example, a law that is part of the law of Canada would apply to every Canadian everywhere in Canada, right? Local organizations will define their own behavior within that context, within the context of Canadian law, within the context of Ontario law, right? We're all operating within that legal system. But within that, there's variation. There are different kinds of behaviors that are acceptable under the law. And what we're trying to do with these policies is get to how we want to operate within that legal context. And that's what the policies are meant to express. They are distinct from our organization's bylaw. Our organization's bylaw is meant to talk about how we're structured, how we operate, right? What the policies are meant to do is describe how we intend to behave, how we intend to act when we engage in our activities and the furtherance of our goals. So that's not necessarily something that impacts all of the citizens of a nation or a province. They only apply to us and how we as an organization want to organize and operate. Does that help clarify?
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Okay. Where were you when we were drafting these policies? We could have used your help.
Hi, Yan. This is Dome. I just actually have two questions.
Sure.
Number one is regarding the scope of this policy. If I apologize, I didn't read the policy yet,
No,
but
okay.
just by what I heard from you, so the policy covers the board members and the volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
Is that this is the only two groups that's included in this association, or also should be including participants or members?
Okay, that's
Yes.
a great question. At one point in the policy, at the very top, it says that it applies to volunteers and directors on the board. Further down in the compliance section, it talks about the fact that we need to have everyone acknowledge that they have read and will agree to abide by this code of conduct. And that includes the members. The reason for that is that it's a way of setting everyone's expectations about how we should treat each other and how we should conduct ourselves and conduct the business of the organization, right? Members are often volunteers. Volunteers are often members. There's a lot of crossover there. Sometimes that changes over time and a member will become a volunteer. Sometimes members will become directors on the board. It's really important for us all to have an understanding of what the expectations are in terms of our behavior. And that does two things. One is it guides our individual behavior, but it also sets our expectations with respect to how the other people around us should behave. And if we see that, for example, if you were to observe me as a director behaving in a way that was against this code, you would be in a position where I would expect you to come forward and confront either me or someone else on the board or the ethics executive and say, I've observed Ian behaving badly, and this is how and when and what happened. And you really need to do something about that, because his ongoing behavior, if he continues that, is going to adversely affect the organization, right? So it really allows us all to get on the same page and move in the same direction.
Right. Maybe just need to clarify a little bit. So for this association, we have board of directors, we have volunteers. Do we have, like, on top of these two groups, do we expect to have no more participants? Or, you know, so that's basically my question. So if the policy is intended to cover everyone, if we have another group of, like, you know, a group that doesn't belong to the volunteers and the board of directors, so should that also be included? Maybe that's my point.
Yeah, I think I would like to have a discussion with the other directors on that point, and because it speaks to how far we can push our jurisdiction. We can guide the behavior of our own members, and we can enforce that through the provisions under the complaint system. So if we have to discipline someone, we have the power to do that. We don't really have the power to discipline another organization other than to discontinue association with them. But what we do by publicly stating our policy and our code of conduct is we say publicly to all other organizations and individuals, this is how we intend to conduct ourselves, and we will not abide other kinds of behavior that, for example, contradict the Human Rights Code, right? We just won't do it. We won't ally ourselves with organizations that support discrimination. We won't associate ourselves with organizations that act dishonestly. We want to be as open and fair and respectful and honest as we can. And we expect that all of the organizations that we do business with will similarly conduct themselves, right?
Yes, yeah, I think Dongmei is talking about members. How about members? So far, our members, all our members are volunteers. So people get their membership by agreeing to be a volunteer. Right. So that's for this year. So maybe next year, most likely we'll do membership in another way to get things easier. Okay. But this year, all members are volunteers.
Okay. In that case, you know, the question answers itself in the sense that this applies to all volunteers. Everybody in the organization is a volunteer, so this applies to everybody in the organization. If we change the parameters around membership and you're not required to be a volunteer in order to be a member, I'm speculating, because this hasn't been put in place yet, but I'm speculating that one of the conditions of membership would be signing off on the code of conduct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, for next year, we may, like it's up to the board, we may ask for a membership fee. So people, by submitting a small amount of membership fee, they become members. But like members or other general public are also welcome to be a volunteer. So in that situation, then this policy, yeah, I think we need to address the governing body, like those volunteers, members, board members.
No, it's a really good question.
Yeah, but we won't be. We don't. This policy does not apply to participants. I mean, the public. When we open our events to the public, they come. They participate. I don't think this policy applies.
It doesn't. I mean, if we were to engage in a public event and someone outside the organization were to act in a discriminatory manner, we would have an obligation to sort of intervene and ask them to cease and desist. And if they continued, we would ask them to leave. There's not much more we can do because, as I mentioned, we don't have disciplinary jurisdiction over people who are not part of our organization. But we can then register a complaint if that person is part of an associated organization. We can register a complaint with that organization. But I think more importantly, the public declaration of what we intend sets the standard for everyone's expectations, whether they're inside the organization or outside of it. And it gives us the opportunity to engage in an assessment of behavior that we feel is inappropriate.
Yeah. Right. So Domi, you said you had the 2 questions. Did you ask both of your questions?
Yeah, I do, but sorry, I just want to also give chance to other people. So sorry, a quick second question also is regarding the policy. If I understand it correctly, that also mentioned that members shouldn't publicly criticize the association. I'm not sure if this will be, you know, that's really something that in practice it might be very hard for the association to enforce that. And also on the other side, that if the association has a proper like a grievance process, that of course everything should be like really should have like internal channel to problem solve. But really, if you put this like not publicly criticize the organization in the policy, I'm not quite sure if that, you know, it's how practical it can be.
Okay, I've got about 4 things that I really want to respond to. First, I agree that enforcement is going to be problematic. We can't possibly monitor everyone's communications all the time, and that's not our intent at all. As I mentioned, the distinction is really between when you are acting on behalf of the organization and when you're not, right? When you're acting on behalf of the organization, you are representing the organization. So if you publicly criticize the organization, you're acting against the interests of the organization, and you are essentially undercutting your own representation. The idea is that in your personal life, criticism is a necessary part of growth, right? And I think that your point about taking it through the appropriate channels is really important to emphasize here. It's not that the organization is against criticism. We need criticism, constructive criticism. Let me be clear about that. There are 2 kinds of criticism. There's destructive and constructive. Destructive criticism is simply calling something down and saying that it's bad and suggesting that people don't associate with it, right? Constructive criticism is saying, hey, I think there's a problem here, and here's a possible solution you might want to consider to solve that problem. Those are 2 very different ways of criticizing something. One is destructive in that it doesn't actually offer any remedy. It simply detracts from the reputation of the organization. The other is becoming a willing participant in the solution of a problem. And in order to do that, if you were to bring your criticism, your observations, your suggestions of how to do it better into the organization itself and air those criticisms or those concerns within the context of the organization, it gives all of us the opportunity to evaluate those suggestions and possibly make change and move things in the right direction if they really aren't going as well as they could. The idea is that the board of directors is obligated to review all possible things that they know of and make the best decisions they can under the circumstances for the good of the organization as a whole, for its mandate, for its objectives. So criticism is actually something that's welcome. You know, there are 8 of us on the board right now. We're not omnipotent. We don't know everything. We can't. We're just human beings. We're volunteers. So if you as a 9th or 10th or 100th party comes to us and says, hey, I think you could be doing this better, that actually helps us, right? That is actually helpful. And it's the right way to do it. Rather than going onto social media and complaining about what a horrible organization we are and how we're doing everything wrong, right? So I think if the worry is that we're trying to restrict your personal freedom and freedom of speech, that's not it at all. What we are asking is that you act as a representative of the organization in the best interests of the organization. And that includes thinking critically and bringing concerns to the board so that we can act on them. If we don't know what's going on, we can't act on it. Or there might be circumstances that are guiding our decisions that you as an individual don't know about, right? There's always a conversation to be had. There's always a dialogue to be had. And part of the process of trying to govern and direct as a director is to listen to as many voices as we can, to hear as many people and their concerns and their ideas as we can, so that we can make the best informed decisions on behalf of the organization. That's really what we're trying to do. Does that answer your question?
Thanks for the clarification. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think like for some people coming from another country where you do not really like have difficulty to criticize the government or you know some people with authority. For these people, like they might be more sensitive than people who have like lived all their life in a democratic country.
Right.
So they will be sensitive to this idea. You are not allowed to criticize an organization. So that's why when I read all these policies, like these questions,
this is one of the things you
coming up.
This is one of the things you picked out immediately, and I do understand what that what you're trying to say there. I think that the key thing is that it's not a limitation on your ability to criticize. It's a limitation on where and how you criticize, right?
So basically internal, like internal criticism is welcome, but don't go outside to tell everybody what your negative opinion. Actually, I talked to a friend. He told me someone working at CTV like got fired because that person get some negative comments on social media. So against the CTV, and that the person got fired by CTV. So
I was actually privy to a situation a number of years ago where a friend of mine worked for the federal government, and one of her employees was crossing the border and made some disparaging remarks about the border control guards coming back into Canada from the States. And that social media feed was picked up by the RCMP, and the repercussions came back to her in the office, and she was disciplined. I don't think she was fired, but she was definitely put on notice that that kind of social media post was not appropriate, because it undercut the reputation of the integrity of us as a country. And she was an employee of the federal government. So, you know, these things do happen. But if you think about it in terms of your family, say, for example, if you disagree with, you know, some behavior that your brother has, and rather than taking it to your brother or sitting down with your family and saying, you know, I have a problem with my brother's behavior, and trying to work it out inside your family, if you go out and publicly broadcast that your brother's an idiot and he's, you know, behaving badly and he's dishonest, and well, that might impact his ability to get a job or keep the job he has, or, you know, associate with the friends that he does, or, you know, it could have all kinds of negative impacts on him. Rather than trying to solve the problem constructively inside the family, if you take it outside, there can be all kinds of negative consequences. Some you may not even realize. And I think it's much more constructive to bring that kind of criticism inside and talk about it inside. And I guess the other important thing to stress here is that we as a board are really open to that kind of conversation. There is no penalty for coming forward with a criticism. You know, there really isn't anything to be lost by coming forward. So
absolutely,
please do. If you have great ideas, bring them forward. If you have suggestions for how we could do things better, bring it forward. Bring it to us, and as I said, we will look at it and based on the other factors in trying to make the best decisions we can, we will do that.
So what if you have some criticism and you know, come up with it you give it to the board or the president, but what if your criticism is not addressed? The problem is not addressed.
So again, it's part of the duty of the board of directors to take that criticism, evaluate it, and make a decision with respect to it. Okay. What that means is that there may be other factors at play that you as an individual who aren't privy to the information that the board deals with, that might make it very confusing to really truly understand how the decisions are made. Some of that information might be sensitive. Most of it is probably not. From me personally, as one of the directors on the board, if there's no reason not to tell you why we make the decisions we make, I would have no problem explaining to you what the circumstances were that led to the decision we made. There's also, you know, in fairness to the board of directors, there's not always unanimous agreement at the board. Sometimes we will disagree with each other, and decisions will be made anyway. What happens there is that the majority of us voting in favor of a resolution will make that resolution come to be enacted. And the people who voted against it are obligated under their duties as a director to uphold and sustain that resolution, whether they agree with it or not, right? And it's kind of the similar thing with ideas that come from other sources. Sometimes we will say, hey, that's a great idea, let's do that. Other times we will look at a suggestion or a criticism and say, you know, based on the resources we have, the people we have, the knowledge we have, the circumstances we're operating under, this is the best we can do. But in all cases, we will be trying to make decisions that are the best we can do under the circumstances. So not every criticism is going to be addressed in the way that the complainant wants it to. You know, I live in a society where I voted Liberal in the last election. I don't agree with a lot of the stuff the Liberal government has done since they were elected, but I am only one voice, and the majority of Canadians elected the Liberal government. I was not alone in this. And so I must abide by the decisions made by the Liberal government until such time as they hold an election and I have an option to make a different decision, right? If I choose to. This is all part of the process of living in a democracy. We muddle along as best we can. We criticize the heck out of, of the decision makers. And we hope that they, on the whole, make the best decisions they can based on what they're given to work with, right? Just as another example, a lot of the decisions that have been made with respect to the rollout of vaccines in Ontario are pretty questionable. But at the end of the day, we have a vaccine program that is the envy of the world, right? So we have a better vaccination rate here than just about anywhere else on the planet. And so despite its detractions, despite its difficulties, despite the criticism that we could level at the government and be justified in doing, at the end of the day, we end up with a pretty good product. And I'm hoping that that process will translate into what we're doing here for East and West Learning Connections. That's the goal.
Okay. Yeah. I remember I have another question, like misrepresentation. What kind of behavior can you think of that can lead to misrepresentation of the organization?
Easiest example I can think of in that regard is something where we present an image to the general public about programs we're going to develop or people we're going to impact or changes we're going to make that we have no intention of making or no intention of putting into practice, right? If we go out on a fundraising campaign, for instance, and we say, you know, all funds raised are going to be used for X program, whatever that program is, and then we don't do that, that's misrepresentation. It's basically lying about what you're doing, right? That's the most straightforward example I can think of.
Okay, so for our members here, any questions for Ian?
Please have questions.
Hello, it's Judith. How are you?
Hi, Judith. How are you?
Hi, Judith.
I could listen to you do a phone directory, Ian.
I love you too, Judith.
Someone said you had a very good broadcasting voice, and that's, you know, that's it. Yeah. Because you're dealing with, you know, pretty dry topics.
It is, yeah, yeah.
But, you know, as a part of the conversation, casual conversation, people come to it, and they come, hopefully will come more than once and then, you know, not show up again. But generally, you know, we want to talk about casual things. Some people are, you know, kind of determined that they want to get their point of view, could be a political or a moral or ethical point of view. Right. So, or they might want, you know, to do something like be on the group with one of the volunteers, like get together or whatever. And I don't know if that comes under privacy, probably more than code of conduct, but, you know, I guess they have a right to, you know, to say what they say, as long as it's, as you say, not inflammatory or, I mean, they have an opinion. It hasn't happened where, you know, people have, well, there's been I shouldn't say it has happened a couple of times, even in our 6 times of conversation. Right. So I don't know where code of conduct fits in there, but also I don't want to be so constricted that I'm going to worry about everything anybody says, right, and feel like, you know, I can't run a comfortable, casual conversation. So I don't know if I have a question. It's a comment about, you know.
Yeah. The issue of free speech is something that I think most people here in North America take really seriously. The Americans probably more than Canadians. But there are, you know, as I was saying right at the opening about the limitations on my free will being limited by the possibility of my free will actions harming others, right? I can't exercise my free will absolutely freely because some of the things I might do might hurt other people. And that's true of speech as well. We have in Canada legislation on the books about hate speech. And that is pretty clearly defined as the kind of thing that incites people to act in harmful ways. Having particular opinions is not something that's covered by hate speech. It's typically, we push the line pretty far out when it comes to free speech. We're allowed to say a lot of things. What we're not allowed to do is incite other people to hatred, to specifically to hateful acts. So that is a judgment, I guess, as it would be in any conversation. If I were to have people in my home who were saying things that were very uncomfortable to me, I would be obliged to say, you know, that's a topic that I disagree with, and it, you know, further discussion is only going to upset me because you and I disagree on this. So can we set that aside and talk about something else? Making the judgment on that is really an individual call in the circumstances. I'm not sure I can offer general guidance or even policy direction when it comes to that sort of thing.
Well, that's fine. I just wanted to put it on the table.
Yeah, no, understood. Yes, there is an obligation to respond to one of your points about privacy. Any information that is gathered by East and West Learning Connections is required by law to be maintained in a sensitive state and is not to be shared without the consent, the expressed consent of the individual whose information it is. So for example, if someone were to come to Yang and say, can I have Ian's home address? Her response would be, no, no, you can't. What I can do, she might say, is I can take your contact information and pass it along to Ian and allow him to make the decision on whether or not he wants to contact you and divulge that information, right? But as an organization, we have an obligation not to surrender that kind of information, personal information about people.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I did when our facilitator and a participant, they wanted to contact each other. So I got their consent. And when they both wanted to, you know, continue, I'll send them both an email, but also give a disclaimer. So I'll write something like a disclaimer in the email. So people, they're all grown-ups, so they need to take care of their own safety.
Yeah, the situation there, I think, is that you want to get consent from the person asking for the information. Mm-hmm. So if, say, if Judith came to you and asked for my information, then your obligation is to ask Judith to provide her information. So get her consent to divulge her information to me, and then pass that on to me and allow me to make the decision about whether to contact, right?
Yeah, and when both of you agree, I send both of you an email, and and ask you respectively to take care of your own safety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we cannot guarantee, we cannot back up any individual's behavior.
That's right.
Yeah.
What happens outside the organization is outside the organization.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I'm happy to help people get connected. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
If they give their consent, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yep. If they both want to, yeah.
Yep.
Sorry, I have a question. Speaking of the privacy, for example, like the Zoom recording, like this, if people showing the face and then say how this recording will be handled.
Okay.
So at the beginning, we'll say we're going to record it. So if anybody does not, then just stop the video, so they will not, show on the screen. And it's if our lecturer or like the guest speaker, if they do not want to share the video, then we will not share it.
There's a couple of things about Zoom. I don't know what pops up visually because I'm legally blind, so I don't see the screen, but my screen reader basically tells me when the recording starts that by continuing to participate in this Zoom session, now that it's being recorded, I am implicitly giving my consent to be recorded. So I'm not sure if there's a pop-up or something that happens.
Yes, I also heard it. Like you can choose continue or you can choose exit.
Right.
Yes.
So you're free to leave the meeting once it's being recorded. The other thing that you can do is, as Yang was saying, you can turn off your video. The other thing that I suggest to anyone who is calling in from a telephone line, you do have the opportunity to change that information on the participants list, because if you don't have a smartphone that has a profile on it with a name, what will show up is your phone number, which is a little disconcerting for some people. So I suggest that anyone who calls in change their how they're presented in the participants list. And if you can't do it from your phone, then ask the moderator to do it. What will happen to this recording, Yang? Will we be posting this?
Pardon me?
Will we be posting this on the website?
Yes, we have a YouTube channel. We can just upload the audio part. Yeah, because I don't know, is there anybody shown on the screen? I cannot see either. So I guess
this is the problem.
Turn off your video?
No, I've got mine on.
My video is not on. Oh, you kept it on?
Yeah, I think I've got mine on.
Yeah, we can just upload the audio part. Yeah. So Dome, do you have any suggestion?
No, I just I just think that if you have to post publicly, and then because from time to time people might turn on their camera, and then in that case you might need to get the consent, and then if they have many recordings, that'll be quite complicated. Just in case people might sue you, right? For their
usually in an event we'll tell people we're going to record this session, so then people will have this heads up. So then they can decide whether to turn on or off their video.
It's an interesting question, because I've participated in literally thousands of Zoom calls over the last 2 years, and I don't think I've ever had anybody leave the meeting once it started
because of the recording.
Yeah.
Like from my experience, like in my company, people are very sensitive on the recording. Right. So of course, there's also some liability or legal issue there in case people didn't approve and you record it. So so let's just bring this up, put this on the table.
Yeah. Oh, so what does your organization do then? domain. So when people do not want to be recorded.
For the recording, we have to ask for, the consent. And if anybody doesn't agree, and then so we cannot. And then even though we also tell them for what purpose and how soon we're going to delete this and so on. So yeah.
Yeah.
I sense another policy coming on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So far, our practice is to leave this to the guest speaker. So the guest speaker giving the lecture, if he or she wants okay with the recording, we'll record, but we'll tell participants about this, and they can choose to stay or to leave or to turn off their video. That's what we do right now.
It's an interesting point, though. It's something that definitely will want to be teased out over the next little while.
Okay, yeah. So I'm looking at the time. So it's a bit way later than 9 o'clock. Are there any other questions for Ian?
And again, if you think of other things that will come to you later, definitely send us an email. We'd be happy to respond to it.
Yeah, to info@eawlc.org.
Yeah.
And next week, next Wednesday, it will be conflict of interest. Ian?
Yeah.
Is that? Okay. All right.
Oh, the fun never stops.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Oh, Zara raised a hand.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Zara, just go ahead.
I mean, just a general question. This is the same link that we have to click. Is the same Zoom link for next week and the following weeks, or are you sending a new Zoom link?
Yes, it's the same. It's the same link for all the 5 sessions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Makes it easy, right?
Yeah. So yeah, it's direct link. So all right. Well, thanks to everybody for participating in this information session, and thank you so much, Ian.
No problem at all.
For the presentation and the answers.
You're very welcome. I'm looking forward to the next 4 sessions. I hope you guys can all come back.
Yeah, and and with more questions, either before or after the session. So yeah, before the session, if you have any questions, just send it to us. Then Ian can prepare more, to address those questions. That would be
Hopefully.
Great.
Hopefully.
Oh, you have to do some research.
Yeah.
Okay. All right then, everybody.
Excellent. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Have a good night, everybody.